if anything happens to the commander-in-chief, the vice president takes over in that role. But that role was not defined in the Constitution. In fact, for the first many decades, no one really thought about what would happen if the president were to die. All of a sudden, everyone had to think about that in the year 1841, when the 9th President of the United States, William Henry Harrison, died in office after only 1 month as president. There wasn't much time to think about what to do, though, because his vice president, John Taylor, immediately took the oath of office. There wasn't a lot of discussion, there weren't a lot of debates, no one voted. He just said, well, I'm the vice president, automatically I should take over as the president. And by doing so, he accomplished 2 things. Firstly, he set the precedent for what happens when the president dies or becomes incapacitated in some way. The vice president immediately takes the oath of office. That position must not be empty. And because of that, that has happened every time since. But he achieved another thing when he did that. He alienated himself from both political parties ultimately and would gain a lot of opposition. Now, it wasn't just because he took that action, it was because of what he did after taking that action. But that was just the first step in his being bold and really unconcerned with what people around him thought. He was dubbed his accidency. Now, at this time, there were 2 major political parties, the Democratic Party and the Whig Party, which you could say is more closely aligned to, in the earliest days, the Federalist Party, which favored a stronger central government, and perhaps in modern times you could say the Republican Party, but the Democratic Party now is very different than it was then. The Democratic Party was the descendant of the Democratic-Republican Party, which sprung up as early as Thomas Jefferson's time when he was the 3rd president. And it advocated for strong rights of the individual states. Now, who was John Tyler? He, of course, was the running mate of William Henry Harrison. Their campaign slogan was Tippecanoe and Tyler too, because William Henry Harrison was dubbed Old Tippecanoe due to the fact that the valiant war hero's most famed battle victory was in the Battle of Tippecanoe. There's been a lot of debate over when, why, and how Tyler ended up getting the nomination as vice president. Most people agree it's just because there wasn't another person who seemed like a good choice in the Whig Party. The Whig Party had just started at this point. The Federalist Party was gone, the Democratic-Republican Party had split into the National Republican Party and the Democratic Party, but the Republican was fading away at this point, so it was basically just the Democrats and whoever opposed them, and many different parties sprung up to oppose the Jacksonian Democrats under Andrew Jackson. A lot of people disagreed with what he did, and so that sort of became a whole political cause, being against Andrew Jackson. And the Whigs were one party which sprung up in that time period. But again, they didn't have a lot of organization or a very strong campaign platform besides that they were against the Democrats. And in this somewhat confusing time, William Henry Harrison came to the forefront as a man of the people, as opposed to Martin Van Buren, the 8th President of the United States, who was seen as too aristocratic. And an important thing was to get people from all different sides of the country. Since Harrison was a Northerner, the Whig Party was concerned about getting Southerners involved too, because even though this was a couple of decades before the Civil War, the tension that would lead to it was already pulling the North and South apart, as they had very different needs. And by this point, the North was basically free of slaves, whereas the South still relied heavily on slave labor, so that was a very hot issue for decades before the Civil War. John Tyler came from Virginia, and being a Southerner was something which defined his political career just as much as being an American. He came from a family which was a plantation owner. He was well educated, following the tradition of the men in his family, going to the William and Mary College in Williamsburg, and there he was educated to go in the law profession. He ended up being admitted to the bar at the age of 19, which was actually too young at that time according to the law, but he got in simply because the judge didn't ask him how old he was. He had a private law practice before going into politics himself. He became very involved in the Virginia government. And this meant that he was following in the footsteps of many of the presidents who had come before him. The majority of U.S. presidents up to this point were from the state of Virginia. including George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and many others. As a matter of fact, there were so many presidents from Virginia in these early days that they were called the Virginia Dynasty.